Hello, sweet peas and sugar dumplings, ghosts, ghouls, and pumpkins. It's time for another story time with Shining Nathan, Spooky Season Edition. Now, we're continuing this journey along with our wonderful horror author, Edgar Allan Poe, in his story, The Masque of the Red Death. Now, before we begin, I apologize for the sound of my voice. The weather's changing here in Lisboa, and so I'm a little congested, but I still have to give you this story. Now, if you followed me here from TikTok, I'm very blessed to have you. If you found me organically, welcome. Comment below what is your favorite horror movie. Remember to turn on that notification bell, like, and subscribe, and do all those things. Now, you can either go grab and pause here and go grab yourself a snack, something to drink, and get all cuddled up for this spooky tale. Or you can settle me down on the table or wherever so you can go about your day while you listen to me read. Now, let's get into The Masque of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal. The redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, then profuse bleeding at the pores with disillusion. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest ban, which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow man. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends among the knights and the dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall girdled it in. This wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and macy hammers and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave no means either of ingress or egress to the sudden impulses of despair or of frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to the contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatori, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All these and security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was toward the close of the 5th or 6th months of his seclusion, while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, and the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends in a mass ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was voluptuous seeing that masquerade. But first, let me tell you of the rooms in which it is held. There were 7, an imperial suite. In many palaces, however, such suites form a long, straight vista, while the folding doors slanting neatly back nearly to the walls on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here, the case was very different, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced by little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass, whose colors varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue and vivid blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple, The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished and lightened with orange, and fifth with white, and sixth with violet. The seventh apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon a carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now, in no one of the 7 apartments were there any lamps or candelabrum. Amid the profusion of golden ornaments that lay scattered to and fro or depended from the roof, there was no light of any kind emanating from lamp or candle within the suite of chambers. But in the corridor that followed the suites, there stood opposite to each window a heavy tripod, bearing a brazier of fire that projected its rays through the tinted glass, so glaringly illuminating the rooms, and thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastical appearances. But in the western or black chamber, the effect of the firelight, which streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes, was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenance of those who entered, that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within the precincts at all. It was in this apartment that also stood against the eastern wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with dull, heavy, monotonous clang, and when the minute hand made the circuit of the face, the hour was to be stricken. There came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear, loud, and deep, and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that at each lapse of an hour the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance, to hearken to the sound. And thus the waltzers perforce ceased their revolutions, and there was a brief discord of the whole gay and fantastic company. And while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows as if in confused reverie or meditation. But when the echoes had finally ceased, and the light laughter at once pervaded the assembly, the musicians looked at each other and smiled as if their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows each to the other that the next chime of the clock should produce in them no similar emotion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embraced 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, there came yet another chiming of the clock, and then with the same disconcert and tumultuousness and meditations as before. But in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had fine eye for colors and effects. He disregarded the decor of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. There were some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. He had directed in great part the movable embellishments of the 7 chambers upon occasion of his great feat, and it was his own guiding taste which gave character to the masqueraders. Be sure they were grotesque. There were much glare and glitter and punk and phantasm, much of what was been seen since Hermione. There were arabesque figures with unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies such as the madman fancies. There were much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might be excited disgust. To and fro in the 7 chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams, and these the dreams writhed in and about, taking hues from the rooms and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as the echo of their steps. And anon there strikes the ebony clock, which stands in the hall of the velvet, and then for a moment all is still. and all is silent save for the voice of the clock. The dreams are still frozen as they stand, but the echoes of the chime die away, and then, having endured but an instant, and a light, half-subdued laughter floats after them as they depart, and now again the music swells, and the dreams live and writhe to and fro more merrily than ever, taking hue from the many-tinted windows through which stream the rays from the tripod. But the chamber which lies most westerly of the seven, there are none of the maskers who venture, for the night is waning away, and there flows a ruddier light through the blood-colored panes, and the blackness of the sable drapery appalls. And to him whose foot falls upon the sable carpet, there comes from the near clock of ebony a muffled peal more solemnly emphatic than any which reaches their ears, who indulge in the more remote gaieties of the other apartments. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life, and the revel went writhingly on until at length there commenced the sounding of midnight upon the clock, and then the music ceased, as I have told, and the evolutions of the waltzers were quieted, and there was an uneasy cessation of all things as before. But now there was 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock, and thus it happened, perhaps, that more of thought crept with more of time into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who revelled, and thus, too, it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure which had arrested the attention of no single individual before. And the rumor of this now new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz or murmur, expressive of disapprobation and surprise, then finally of terror, of horror, or of disgust, and of disgust. In an assembly of phantasms such as I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such sensation. In truth, the masquerade license of the night had nearly unlimited, but the figure in question had out-Heroded Herod, and gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's infinite decorum. There were chords in his heart of the most reckless which cannot be touched without emotion. Even with the utterly lost, to whom life and death are equally jets, there were matters of which no jest can be made. The whole company, indeed, seemed now deeply to feel that the costume and bearing of the stranger were neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed the visage was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a corpse that the closest scrutiny must have had difficulty in detecting the cheat, and yet all this might have been endured if not approved by the mad revellers around, but the murmur had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His vesture was dabbed in blood, and his broad brow, with all the features of the face, was besprinkled with the scarlet blood of horror. When the eyes of Prince Prospero fell upon this spectral image, which was a slow and solemn movement, as if more fully to sustain its role, stalked to and fro among the waltzers, he was seen to be convulsed in the first moment with a strong shudder of horror, terror, or distaste, but in the next his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares," he demanded hoarsely of the courtiers who stood near him, "who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know who has had sunrise from the battlements, so he may hang from those battlements." It was in the eastern or blue chamber in which stood the Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. He rang throughout the several rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was bold and robust a man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where stood the prince, with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of his group in the direction of the intruder, who at the moment was also near at hand, and now, with a deliberate and stately step, made closer approach the speaker. But from a certain nameless awe which the mad assumptions of the murmur had inspired the whole party, there were found none put forth hand to seize him, so that unimpeded he passed into the yard of the prince's person, while the vast assembly, as if one impulse, shrank from the centers of the room to the walls. He made his way uninterrupted, but with the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from the first, through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to the violet, ere a decided movement been made to arrest him. It was then, however, that Prince Prospero, maddened with rage and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on account of the deadly terror that was seized upon all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger, and approached in rapid impunitude to within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There, with a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which instantly afterwards fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment and seized the murmur, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless, with the shadow of the ebony clock gasping in unenumerated horror at finding the grave cerements and corpse-like mass which they handled with so violent a rudeness untainted by any tangible form. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the courtiers and revelers and the prince in the bedewed halls of their revel, and died, each in the despairing posture of his fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last of the gay, and the flames of the tripods expired, and darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. I hope you enjoyed this story of the Masque of the Red Death. If you heard my neighbors being noisy going through the halls, I apologize. That stairway echoes very loudly. As always, special thank you to my patrons on Patreon who make this content possible, and thank you for enjoying this tale. Feel free to comment what you'd like to hear next, and if you enjoy my content, consider becoming a patron on Patreon at patreon.com/Shining Nathan. As always, I love you. Take care.